Chapter 1: Whispers in the Green. The oppressive humidity clung to Dr. Aris Thorne like a shroud as he stepped off the battered Bell 212 helicopter. The rotors wound down with a mournful groan, and the thick air filled with the cacophony of the rainforest, the ceaseless chirping of insects, the croaking of unseen frogs, and the distant, guttural calls of monkeys. He adjusted his thick glasses, the lenses immediately fogging over in the damp heat. "Welcome to paradise, Doctor," Mac Bellwether drawled, leaning against the helicopter's skid. Mac, the outpost security chief, was a mountain of a man, his face weathered and scarred, his eyes holding the distant gaze of someone who'd witnessed too much. His faded camouflage uniform seemed permanently damp. Thorne offered a weak smile. Paradise was the last word he'd used to describe this place. He'd seen paradise once, a long time ago before it was ripped away. The outpost itself was a cluster of prefabricated buildings, surrounded by a high chain-link fence topped with razor wire. It looked less like a scientific research facility and more like a prison camp. Thorne knew the funding for this expedition hadn't come from the most savory sources. "Dr. Thorne, a pleasure," Issa Silva said, approaching with a bright, almost blinding smile. She was young, energetic, her enthusiasm radiating like heat from a furnace. She wore practical khaki shorts and a short-sleeved shirt, her dark hair pulled back in a neat ponytail. "I'm Issa Silva, lead biologist. We've been expecting you." "The pleasure is all mine, Dr. Silva," Thorne replied, extending a hand. Her grip was firm, confident. He couldn't help but wonder if that confidence would survive the coming weeks. "Please call me Issa. Everyone does." She gestured towards the main building, a long, low structure with barred windows. "Let's get you settled in. I'm eager to hear your thoughts on the samples we've collected." As they walked, Thorne took in the details of the outpost. Scientists in lab coats hurried between buildings. Workers in faded uniforms carried supplies. The air hummed with the constant drone of generators. It was a hive of activity, a stark contrast to the untamed wilderness surrounding it. Inside the main building, the air conditioning offered a brief respite from the humidity. Issa led him to a small, sparsely furnished office. "This is yours for the duration. I hope it meets your needs." "It's adequate," Thorne said, placing his worn leather briefcase on the desk. The office contained a desk, a chair, a cot, and a small bookshelf. The walls were bare, painted a drab institutional green. He opened his briefcase and removed a framed photograph. It was a picture of a woman with kind eyes and a warm smile. He placed it on the desk, a reminder of what he'd lost and what he was fighting for. "So the fungus," Issa said, her eyes gleaming with excitement. "Have you read my preliminary reports?" "I have," Thorne replied. "Fascinating, a completely new species exhibiting unusual properties." "Unusual is an understatement," Issa said, chuckling. "It's rewriting the rules of biology, the way it interacts with the local fauna. It's unlike anything I've ever seen." "The symbiotic relationships are particularly intriguing," Thorne said, thinking of the reports he'd read. The sloth shroom, as they dubbed it, was a prime example. A sloth that allowed the fungus to grow on its fur, providing camouflage and nutrients in exchange for the fungus's protection. A bizarre, almost beautiful partnership. Intriguing and terrifying, Issa corrected. Have you seen the jaguar bloom? Thorn shook his head. Only in the photographs. I'm eager to see it firsthand. I can arrange that, Issa said. But be warned, Doctor, it's not a pretty sight. As if on cue, a siren wailed, cutting through the air. Red lights flashed in the hallway. What's going on? Thorn asked, his hand instinctively reaching for his briefcase. Breach, Issa said, her face hardening. Perimeter breach. Mac will handle it. Mac's voice crackled over the intercom. All personnel locked down. Perimeter breach in Sector 4. I repeat, perimeter breach in Sector 4. Issa grabbed a radio from the desk. Mac, what's the situation? Something got through the fence, Mac's voice replied, strained. Big something. I'm heading there now with a squad. Be careful, Mac, Issa said, her voice tight. Always am, Mac replied. The radio went silent. Thorn watched Issa, his unease growing. He had come here to study a fungus, not to face some unknown threat. But he knew, deep down, that the two were connected. The fungus was changing things, twisting the natural order. And whatever had breached the perimeter was a product of that change. We should head to the lab, Issa said, breaking the silence. It's the safest place. They hurried down the hallway, the red lights casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. Thorn could hear the distant sound of gunfire. The air was thick with tension, the promise of violence hanging heavy in the air. As they reached the lab, Thorn caught a glimpse of Dr. Jian Li through the window. The geneticist was hunched over a microscope, oblivious to the chaos unfolding outside. Thorn had heard rumors about Li, whispers of unethical experiments and a dangerous obsession with the fungus's genetic code. He didn't trust him. Issa unlocked the lab door and ushered Thorn inside. The lab was a sterile, brightly lit space filled with equipment and samples. The air smelled of chemicals and disinfectant. It was a sanctuary, a haven from the madness outside. We'll be safe here, Issa said, her voice trying to project confidence. But Thorn saw the fear in her eyes. They were trapped, waiting for whatever horror had breached the perimeter to find them. And he knew with a growing certainty that it wouldn't be long. A guttural roar echoed through the lab, followed by the shattering of glass. Whatever it was inside the outpost, and it was heading their way. Chapter 2. The Jaguar's Bloom. The roar that had shattered the lab's sterile calm still echoed in Thorn's ears. He gripped his briefcase tighter, his knuckles white. Issa moved quickly, pulling down the metal shutters on the windows, plunging the lab into near darkness. Only the emergency lights cast a weak, red glow. What was that? Thorn asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sounds like our jaguar bloom, Issa replied, her face grim. Mac warned me it was getting agitated. I didn't expect it to breach containment. Containment? Thorn asked, his eyes widening. You were keeping that thing contained, in the outpost. We were studying it, Issa said defensively. We needed to understand how the fungus was affecting it. And now it's loose, Thorn said, his voice laced with anger. Thanks to your studies, we're all sitting ducks. I didn't anticipate this, Issa said, her voice low. We thought we had it under control. Another roar, closer this time. The walls of the lab vibrated. Thorn could hear the sound of tearing metal, the unmistakable sound of something large and powerful ripping through the outpost's defenses. "It's getting closer," Issa said, her hand hovering over a panic button on the wall. "I need to contact Mac." She raised her radio. "Mac, do you read? The Jaguar bloom is loose in the lab sector. I repeat, the Jaguar bloom is loose in the lab sector." "Static, only static." "Mac, come in," Issa said, her voice rising in desperation. "Mac, can you hear me?" Still nothing. "Something's wrong," Issa said, her face pale. "Something's very wrong." Thorn knew it. Mac, with all his experience, wouldn't go silent unless something catastrophic had happened. The Jaguar bloom wasn't just loose, it was winning. "We need to get out of here," Thorn said, his eyes scanning the lab for an escape route. "There has to be another way out." "There's a service tunnel," Issa said, pointing to a metal door in the corner of the lab. "It leads to the generator room. From there, we can reach the outer fence." "Let's go," Thorn said, grabbing his briefcase. He moved towards the door, his heart pounding in his chest. As they reached the door, Thorn noticed that Dr. Lee was still hunched over his microscope, oblivious to the chaos. "Dr. Lee," Thorn said, raising his voice, "we need to evacuate. The Jaguar bloom is loose." Lee didn't respond. He didn't even acknowledge Thorn's presence. He was completely absorbed in whatever he was studying. "Dr. Lee," Thorn shouted, grabbing the geneticist's shoulder. Lee jumped, startled. He turned to Thorn, his eyes wide and unfocused. "What is it?" Lee asked, his voice trembling. "Can't you see I'm busy?" "Busy?" Thorn said, his voice incredulous. "The entire outpost is under attack and you're worried about your research." "This research is crucial," Lee said, his voice rising. "It could change everything." "It already has," Thorn said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Now, are you coming with us, or are you going to stay here and become Jaguar food?" Lee hesitated for a moment, then reluctantly nodded. He grabbed a small case from the table and followed Thorn and Issa to the service tunnel door. Issa punched in a code on the keypad and the door hissed open. The tunnel was narrow and dimly lit, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and mildew. "Stay close," Issa said, leading the way. "It's not a long tunnel, but it's easy to get lost." They moved quickly through the tunnel, Thorn bringing up the rear, his briefcase clutched tightly in his hand. The tunnel walls were cold and damp, the silence broken only by the sound of their footsteps and the occasional drip of water. Suddenly, a high-pitched screech echoed through the tunnel. Thorn froze, his blood running cold. "What was that?" Lee asked, his voice trembling. "Shroombat," Issa said, her voice grim. "They're attracted to the darkness." Thorn had read about the Shroombats in Issa's reports. Bats infected with the fungus, their wings covered in grotesque fungal growths, emitting hallucinogenic spores. Nasty creatures. Another screech, closer this time. Thorn could hear the flapping of wings. "We need to hurry," Issa said, her voice urgent. "They're coming." They broke into a run, the tunnel walls blurring past them. The screeching grew louder, closer. Thorn could almost hear the beating of the shroombat's fungal wings. Suddenly, a shroombat swooped down from the ceiling, its fungal wings brushing Thorn's face. He recoiled in horror, swatting at the creature. "Ugh!" Thorn yelped as the spores from the bat's wings filled his nostrils. The cave began to swirl around him, growing smaller and smaller, then bigger and bigger. The sound seemed to amplify, his blood rushing in his ears. The walls closed in on him, but at the same time seemed to stretch away into infinity. He stumbled, losing his balance. He struggled to regain his footing, but the tunnel was spinning, the walls shifting and changing. He couldn't tell which way was up, which way was down. His head was swimming. "Thorn," he heard Issa shout, but her voice sounded distant, distorted. He tried to focus on her, but his vision was blurring, the tunnel dissolving into a swirling vortex of colors and shapes. He could hear voices now, whispering in his ear. Voices he didn't recognize, voices he couldn't understand. They were speaking to him, telling him things, showing him things he didn't want to see. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to block out the voices, the images. But it was no use. They were inside his head, invading his thoughts, twisting his memories. He started to scream, but no sound came out. He was trapped, lost in a nightmare of his own making. And he knew, with a growing sense of dread, that there was no escape. Chapter 3: Hallucinations and Horror. The world dissolved around Thorn. One moment he was in the claustrophobic tunnel, the next he was floating in a vast, empty space. Colors swirled around him, vibrant greens, pulsating reds, and sickly yellows. Shapes shifted and morphed, becoming grotesque and disturbing. He felt disoriented, lost, adrift in a sea of madness. He saw faces, faces he recognized, faces he didn't. His mother, her face contorted in a silent scream. His wife, her eyes filled with accusation. Faces of strangers, their features twisted into mocking grins. The voices intensified, whispering secrets, planting doubts, stirring up long-buried fears. They spoke of his failures, his regrets, his deepest insecurities. They told him he was weak, worthless, a failure. He tried to fight back, to resist the voices, the images, but it was no use. They were too powerful, too insidious. They had burrowed into his mind, taking root, poisoning his thoughts. He saw the research outpost, not as it was, but as a decaying, monstrous structure, overgrown with fungus, pulsating with a sickly green light. The scientists, no longer human but grotesque parodies of their former selves, their bodies twisted and deformed by the fungus. He saw Issa, her eyes hollow, her skin covered in fungal growths. She reached out to him, her hand a mass of writhing tendrils. "Join us, Aris," she whispered, her voice a raspy croak. "Become one with the fungus." He recoiled in horror, trying to escape her grasp. But she was everywhere, her face looming over him, her voice echoing in his mind. He saw the jaguar bloom, not as a hybrid creature, but as a manifestation of his own inner demons, a symbol of his rage, his frustration, his suppressed desires. The jaguar stalked him through the hallucination, an unyielding beast with its sights set on a kill. He tried to run, but his legs were heavy, unresponsive. He was trapped, forced to confront his fears, his weaknesses, his failures. The voices grew louder, more insistent, until he couldn't bear it anymore. He wanted to scream, to beg for mercy, but he couldn't find his voice. He was drowning in a sea of madness, slowly suffocating under the weight of his own guilt and self-loathing. Suddenly, a flicker of clarity, a brief moment of lucidity. He realized what was happening. The shroombat's spores. They were playing tricks on his mind, distorting his perceptions, amplifying his fears. He had to fight it. He had to resist the hallucinations. He had to regain control. He focused his mind, trying to shut out the voices, the images. He concentrated on his breathing, trying to slow his racing heart. He repeated his name, his age, his profession, anything to anchor himself to reality. Slowly, gradually, the hallucinations began to fade. The colors became less intense, the shapes less grotesque. The voices grew fainter, less insistent. He was still floating in the void, but the darkness was receding. He could see a faint light in the distance, a glimmer of hope. He focused on the light, drawing strength from it. He reached out towards it, willing himself to move to escape the darkness. The light grew brighter, closer. He could feel its warmth, its energy. It was pulling him, guiding him, leading him back to reality. With a final surge of will, he broke free from the hallucinations. He gasped for air, his lungs burning. He blinked his eyes, trying to clear his vision. He was back in the tunnel. The walls were still damp and cold, but they were solid, real. The air still smelled of mildew, but it was clean, breathable. Issa was kneeling beside him, her face etched with concern. Lee was standing behind her, his eyes wide with fear. "Thorn, are you all right?" Issa asked, her voice trembling. "What happened?" "Shroombat," Thorn croaked, his throat dry. "Spores. Hallucinations." "I tried to warn you," Issa said, her voice filled with regret. "I'm so sorry." "It's not your fault," Thorn said, struggling to sit up. "I'll be all right. Just give me a moment." He took a few deep breaths, trying to regain his composure. The hallucinations were fading, but their effects lingered. He still felt disoriented, shaken. He knew he wouldn't be the same after that experience. "We need to keep moving," Issa said, helping him to his feet. "The generator room is just ahead." They continued through the tunnel, Thorn walking unsteadily, his hand resting on Issa's shoulder for support. The Shroombats were gone, but the fear remained. He knew they weren't safe yet. As they reached the end of the tunnel, they saw the generator room door. It was a heavy steel door with a small window. Issa peered through the window, then recoiled in horror. "What is it?" Thorn asked, his heart sinking. "Mac," Issa whispered, her voice trembling. He's dead." Thorn pushed past her and looked through the window. He saw Mac lying on the floor, his body twisted at an unnatural angle. His eyes were wide open, staring blankly at the ceiling. His chest was a mass of bloody, torn flesh. Standing over Mac's body was the jaguar bloom. Its fungal fur pulsed with a sickly green light. Its eyes glowed with a malevolent intelligence. It was watching them, waiting for them. They were trapped. Chapter 4: The Generator Room Gauntlet. The sight of Mac's mangled corpse sent a wave of nausea through Thorn. He stumbled back, his hand flying to his mouth. He had seen death before, but there was something particularly gruesome about the way Mac had been torn apart. It was a testament to the raw, untamed power of the jaguar bloom. "We can't go in there," Thorn said, his voice barely audible. "It's suicide." "We don't have a choice," Issa said, her face grim. "It's the only way out." "There has to be another way," Thorn insisted, his eyes darting around the tunnel. "A ventilation shaft, a hidden passage." "There's nothing," Issa said, her voice flat. "I designed this outpost. I know every inch of it. This is it." Thorn looked at Lee, hopping for some sign of support. But the geneticist was cowering in the corner, his eyes wide with terror. He was useless. "Fine," Thorn said, his voice resigned. "But we're not going in there unarmed." He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a small, silver pistol. It was an old weapon, a relic from his past. He hadn't fired it in years, but it was better than nothing. "Where did you get that?" Issa asked, her eyes widening. "It's a long story," Thorn said, checking the weapon. "Just be glad I have it." He handed the pistol to Issa. "You take it. You're a better shot than I am." Issa hesitated for a moment, then took the pistol. She held it awkwardly, her finger hovering over the trigger. "I've never fired a gun before," she said, her voice trembling. "There's a first time for everything," Thorn said, trying to sound encouraging. "Just aim and pull the trigger. It's not rocket science." He turned to Lee. "Do you know how to use a weapon?" Lee shook his head, his eyes darting nervously between Thorn and the door. "I'm a scientist, not a soldier." "Great," Thorn muttered. "Just stay behind us and try not to get killed." He took a deep breath, steeling his nerves. He knew their chances of survival were slim. The jaguar bloom was a formidable predator, and they were trapped in a confined space with no escape. But they had to try. "All right," Thorn said, his voice firm. "Here's the plan. Issa, you take the lead, I'll cover your back. Lee, stay close to me. We move quickly, quietly. If the jaguar bloom sees us, we fire. Understand?" Issa and Lee nodded, their faces pale but determined. Thorn took one last look at Mac's body, a wave of grief washing over him. He didn't know Mac well, but he respected him. He was a good man, a brave man. He didn't deserve to die like this. "Let's do it," Thorn said, his voice heavy with resolve. Issa took a deep breath and punched in the code on the keypad. The generator room door hissed open. They stepped into the room, their senses on high alert. The generator room was a large, cavernous space, filled with the deafening roar of the generators. The air was thick with the smell of diesel fuel and ozone. Mac's body lay in the center of the room, a gruesome reminder of the danger that awaited them. The jaguar bloom was nowhere to be seen. "Where is it?" Issa whispered, her eyes darting around the room. "I don't know," Thorn replied, his hand hovering over his briefcase. "But it's here. I can it." Suddenly, a guttural roar echoed through the room. The generators sputtered and died, plunging the room into darkness. "It's here," Issa shouted, raising the pistol. Thorn fumbled for his flashlight, his fingers trembling. He switched it on, the beam cutting through the darkness. The jaguar bloom emerged from the shadows, its fungal fur glowing with a sickly green light. It was even more terrifying than Thorn had imagined. Its eyes burned with a malevolent intelligence, its teeth bared in a savage grin. It charged, its powerful legs pounding against the metal floor. "Fire!" Thorn shouted. Issa squeezed the trigger, the pistol bucking in her hand. The bullet struck the jaguar Bloom in the chest, but it barely seemed to notice. It continued its charge, its eyes fixed on them. "Again!" Thorn shouted. Issa fired again and again, emptying the magazine. The bullets peppered the jaguar Bloom's body, but it kept coming. It was like shooting a tank with a pea shooter. Thorn realized they were out of ammunition. They were defenseless. "Run!" Thorn shouted, grabbing Issa and Lee. They turned and fled, the jaguar Bloom hot on their heels. They scrambled through the darkness, their footsteps echoing in the cavernous room. The jaguar Bloom roared, its voice filled with rage. It was gaining on them. Thorn saw a service door at the far end of the room. It was their only chance. "Head for the door," Thorn shouted. "I'll try to distract it." He shoved Issa and Lee towards the door and turned to face the jaguar Bloom. He knew he was no match for it, but he had to buy them time. He opened his briefcase and pulled out a vial of a clear liquid. It was a sample of the purest form of the howler fungus, the dominant strain. He had brought it with him for research purposes, but now it was their only weapon. He uncorked the vial and hurled the liquid at the jaguar Bloom. The liquid splashed against the creature's face, and it recoiled in pain. It roared, its body convulsing. The fungus was reacting. The pure strain was incompatible with the hybrid's altered physiology. It was a shock to its system. Thorn knew it wouldn't be enough to kill it, but it might buy them a few precious seconds. He turned and ran, joining Issa and Lee at the service door. Issa was frantically trying to open it. "Hurry!" Thorn shouted. "It's coming!" The jaguar Bloom roared again, its voice closer this time. It was recovering from the shock. Issa finally managed to open the door. They scrambled through it, slamming it shut behind them. They were safe for now. Chapter 5: The Fungal Heart. The service door led to a narrow, winding corridor. Thorn slammed the locking mechanism, a flimsy bolt that wouldn't hold the jaguar Bloom for long. He could already hear the creature battering against the other side, the metal groaning under the assault. "This won't hold it," Thorn said, his voice ragged. "We need to move." They stumbled down the corridor, their footsteps echoing in the confined space. The air was thick with the smell of damp concrete and stale air. "Where does this lead?" Thorn asked, glancing back nervously. The door was already beginning to buckle. "To the Central Research Lab," Issa replied, her voice breathless. "It's the most secure area in the outpost. Reinforced walls Bengali, Mba Enus Bengali, Nakat Enus Bengali, Benoy Enus Bengali, Benokat, Enus Hazard seals. It should be able to keep that thing out." "Let's hope so," Thorn said, quickening his pace. They reached the end of the corridor and found themselves facing a heavy steel door with a complex keypad. Issa quickly punched in the code, her fingers flying across the keys. Come on," she muttered under her breath. The door hissed open, revealing a brightly lit laboratory. It was a stark contrast to the dark, oppressive corridor. The lab was filled with sophisticated equipment, gleaming microscopes, and rows of sterile containers. It was a testament to the advanced research that was being conducted at the outpost. "In here," Issa shouted, ushering Thorn and Lee into the lab. Thorn scanned the room, his eyes searching for any sign of danger. The lab appeared to be deserted, but he knew they couldn't let their guard down. The Jaguar Bloom could be anywhere. Issa rushed to a computer terminal and began typing furiously. "I'm activating the security protocols," she said, her voice strained. "Sealing the lab, activating the defense systems." Suddenly, the lights flickered and died, plunging the lab into darkness. A low, guttural growl echoed through the room. "What happened?" Thorn asked, his hand instinctively reaching for his briefcase. "Power surge," Issa replied, her voice trembling. "It must have damaged the generators further." Emergency lights flickered on, casting a weak red glow over the lab. The darkness seemed to amplify the tension, making every shadow seem menacing. "It's here," Lee whispered, his eyes wide with terror. "I can't." Thorn strained his ears, trying to discern the source of the growl. He could hear the faint sound of footsteps, heavy and deliberate. The Jaguar Bloom was stalking them. "Everyone stay close," Thorn said, his voice firm. "Don't move unless I tell you to." They huddled together, their backs against the wall, their eyes scanning the darkness. The silence was broken only by the sound of their ragged breathing and the distant growl of the Jaguar Bloom. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was a scientist, his lab coat stained with blood, his eyes wide with terror. "Help me," the scientist said, his voice hoarse. It's horrible." "What happened?" Issa asked, her voice cautious. "The fungus," the scientist gasped. It's taken over. It's controlling us." "Controlling you?" Thorn asked, his eyes narrowing. "What do you mean?" The scientist's body began to convulse. He clawed at his face, his eyes rolling back in his head. "It's inside me," he screamed. "It's telling me to kill." He lunged at Issa, his hands outstretched, his eyes filled with a murderous rage. "No," Thorn shouted, shoving Issa out of the way. The scientist stumbled, his momentum carrying him forward. He crashed into a nearby table, sending equipment flying. Thorn seized the opportunity and grabbed a heavy metal fire extinguisher from the wall. He swung it with all his might, striking the scientist in the head. The scientist collapsed to the floor, unconscious. "What was that all about?" Thorn asked, his voice shaken. "The fungus," Issa said, her face pale. "It's not just creating hybrids, it's controlling people, turning them into puppets." "Puppets?" Thorn asked, his voice incredulous. "That's impossible." "Nothing is impossible with this fungus," Issa said, her voice grim. "It's rewriting the rules of biology. It's evolving, adapting. It's becoming something more." The growl of the Jaguar Bloom echoed through the lab, closer this time. They were running out of time. "We need to get out of here," Thorn said, his eyes scanning the room. "There has to be a way to stop this thing." "There's one thing," Issa said, her voice hesitant. a sample of the original fungal spores, the pure strain. It's kept in a secure vault in the center of the lab. It's our only chance to synthesize a cure and stop the fungus. What are we waiting for? Thorn asked, his voice filled with urgency. Let's get it. It's not that simple, Issa said, her voice low. The vault is protected by a series of security measures. Laser grids, pressure sensors, biometric scanners. It's designed to be impenetrable. We have to try, Thorn said, his voice firm. It's our only hope. Issa nodded, her face determined. All right, she said, let's do it. They moved cautiously through the lab, their eyes scanning the darkness. The growl of the jaguar bloom grew louder, closer. It was hunting them. They reached the entrance to the vault. It was a massive steel door, reinforced with multiple layers of steel and concrete. A complex array of sensors and scanners surrounded the door. This is it, Issa said, her voice trembling. The fungal heart. Chapter 6, Vault of Spores. The vault door loomed before them, an imposing barrier between them and their only hope. Thorn could hear the jaguar bloom thrashing about in the outer lab, its roars shaking the very foundations of the outpost. Time was running out. All right, Issa, what do we need to do? Thorn asked, trying to keep his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. Issa took a deep breath, her eyes fixed on the security panel beside the vault door. First, we need to bypass the biometric scanner. It requires a specific DNA sequence. Can you do it? Thorn asked, his hand instinctively reaching for his briefcase. He felt a sense of responsibility for their safety, a need to protect Issa and even the cowering Lee, despite his earlier reservations. I think so, Issa replied, her fingers flying across the keypad. I have the sequence in my data pad. It's based on the original fungal strain. She connected her data pad to the security panel, and the screen flickered to life. Lines of code scrolled across the screen as Issa worked to bypass the biometric lock. Almost there, she muttered, her brow furrowed in concentration. Suddenly, the emergency lights flickered again, and the lab plunged into near darkness. The power was failing, and the security systems were starting to malfunction. Hurry, Issa, Thorn urged, his voice strained. Got it, Issa exclaimed, a triumphant grin spreading across her face. Biometric scanner bypassed. The vault door hissed, open a fraction of an inch. Next, we need to disable the laser grid, Issa said, her voice urgent. It's triggered by motion. We need to crawl under it. The laser grid was a complex web of red beams crisscrossing the entrance to the vault. One wrong move, and they'd trigger the alarm, sealing the vault and alerting the jaguar bloom to their presence. Lee, you go first, Thorn said, his eyes fixed on the laser grid. You're the smallest. Lee paled, his eyes widening in terror. I can't, he stammered. I'm too afraid. There's nothing to be afraid of, Thorn said, trying to sound reassuring. Just crawl slowly and carefully. Don't touch the lasers. He gave Lee a gentle push towards the vault entrance. Lee hesitated for a moment, then took a deep breath and dropped to his hands and knees. He began to crawl under the laser grid, his movements slow and deliberate. The red beams danced around him, casting eerie shadows on his face. Thorn held his breath, his eyes fixed on Lee. He was so close, almost there. Suddenly, Lee's hand slipped, and he grazed one of the lasers. A loud alarm blared through the lab, and the vault door slammed shut. "Lee!" Thorn shouted, his voice filled with frustration. "I'm sorry," Lee cried, his voice trembling. "I didn't mean to." "It's too late now," Issa said, her face grim. "The alarm will attract the jaguar bloom." The vault door was sealed, and the laser grid was active. They were trapped. Suddenly, a section of the wall behind them exploded inwards, showering them with debris. The jaguar bloom had broken through. "Run!" Thorn shouted, grabbing Issa and Lee. They scrambled away from the collapsing wall, the jaguar bloom hot on their heels. They were trapped in the lab with no escape. "There's one more thing," Issa said, her voice desperate. "A pressure sensor on the floor in front of the vault door. If we can disable it, we can reopen the vault." "How do we disable it?" Thorn asked, his mind racing. "We need to apply a specific amount of pressure to the sensor," Issa replied. "Not too much, not too little, just the right amount." "How are we supposed to do that?" Thorn asked, his voice incredulous. "I have an idea," Issa said, her eyes gleaming with determination. "But it's risky." She rummaged through her bag and pulled out a small, portable scale. "We can use this to measure the pressure," she said, "but we need something to apply the pressure with." Thorn's eyes fell on the unconscious scientist lying on the floor. "He'll do," Thorn said, his voice grim. They dragged the unconscious scientist to the pressure sensor. Issa positioned the scale on the sensor, and Thorn carefully lifted the scientist, placing him on top of the scale. "Careful," Issa said, her voice strained. "Too much pressure and it'll trigger the alarm again." Thorn slowly lowered the scientist, watching the scale intently. The needle crept towards the target number. "Almost there," Issa muttered, her eyes fixed on the scale. Just as the needle reached the target number, the jaguar bloom burst through the remaining section of the wall, its eyes fixed on them. "Now, Issa," Thorn shouted. Issa pressed a button on the security panel, and the vault door hissed open. "Go, go, go," Thorn shouted, pushing Issa and Lee towards the vault entrance. They scrambled through the opening, the jaguar bloom lunging at them. Thorn turned to face the creature, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew he couldn't stop it, but he could buy them a few more seconds. He grabbed a nearby metal rod and charged at the jaguar bloom, swinging the rod with all his might. The rod struck the creature in the face, momentarily stunning it. Thorn seized the opportunity and sprinted towards the vault, diving through the opening just as the jaguar bloom recovered and charged again. He slammed the vault door shut, sealing himself inside with Issa and Lee. They were safe for now. Chapter 7: Inside the Fungal Core. The vault door hissed shut, sealing them inside a small, sterile room. The air was cold and dry, a stark contrast to the humid, oppressive atmosphere of the rest of the outpost. Thorn leaned against the door, his chest heaving, his muscles aching. He had bought them some time, but he knew the jaguar bloom wouldn't be contained for long. "Are you all right?" Issa asked, her voice filled with concern. She reached out and touched his arm. I'm fine, Thorn said, trying to catch his breath. Just give me a minute. He looked around the vault. It was a small, circular room with smooth, metallic walls. In the center of the room stood a single pedestal, upon which rested a small glass container. Inside the container, a swirling mass of spores pulsed with a faint, ethereal glow. The original fungal spores, Issa said, her voice filled with awe. The source of it all. Thorn approached the pedestal, his eyes fixed on the swirling spores. He could feel a strange energy emanating from the container, a sense of power and potential. It was both terrifying and fascinating. This is it, Thorn said, his voice barely above a whisper. Our only hope. We need to get a sample, Issa said, her voice urgent, and synthesize a cure quickly. She rummaged through her bag and pulled out a small syringe and a vial. I'll do it, she said, approaching the container. Suddenly, Lee grabbed her arm, his eyes wide with fear. Don't, he cried. It's too dangerous. We don't have a choice, Lee, Issa said, her voice firm. This is the only way to stop the fungus. But what if something goes wrong? Lee asked, his voice trembling. What if we unleash something even worse? We can't think like that, Issa said. We have to be brave, we have to take a risk. She gently pushed Lee aside and approached the container. She carefully inserted the syringe into the container and drew out a small amount of the spore solution. Got it, she said, holding up the syringe. Now we need to get back to the lab and synthesize the cure. Suddenly the lights flickered and died, plunging the vault into complete darkness. A low, guttural growl echoed through the room. What was that? Issa asked, her voice filled with dread. It's here, Thorn said, his voice grim. It found a way in. He strained his ears, trying to discern the source of the growl. He could hear the faint sound of scraping, the unmistakable sound of metal tearing. It's breaking through the door, Issa cried, her voice frantic. They were trapped in the vault, with the jaguar bloom about to break in. Their only hope was to synthesize the cure, but they needed light, and they needed equipment. Think, Issa, think, Thorn urged, his mind racing. Is there anything in here that can help us? Issa's eyes scanned the room, her mind working furiously. There's a small emergency generator, she said, her voice hopeful. It's designed to power the life support systems in case of a power failure. Where is it? Thorn asked, his voice filled with urgency. It's behind a panel on the wall, Issa replied, pointing to a section of the wall. But I don't know how to activate it. Thorn rushed to the panel and began fumbling with the latches. He could hear the sound of the vault door buckling. The jaguar bloom was almost through. He finally managed to open the panel, revealing a small generator. It was a complex piece of machinery, with a bewildering array of wires and switches. I don't know what to do, Thorn cried, his voice filled with desperation. Look for a red button, Issa said, her voice urgent. There should be a red button that activates the generator. Thorn scanned the generator, his eyes searching for the red button. He could hear the sound of the vault door tearing. The jaguar bloom was about to break through. He spotted a small red button hidden behind a tangle of wires. He reached out and pressed the button. The generator sputtered to life, filling the vault with a soft, humming sound. The lights flickered on, casting a weak glow over the room. "All right," Issa exclaimed, her voice filled with relief. "Now we need to find the synthesis equipment." She rushed to a small cabinet on the wall and opened it, revealing a collection of beakers, test tubes, and other laboratory equipment. "This is it," she said, grabbing the equipment. "Let's get to work." She set up the equipment on a small table and began to synthesize the cure, her hands moving quickly and efficiently. Thorn stood guard, his eyes fixed on the vault door. He could hear the sound of the jaguar bloom tearing at the metal, its roars filling the room. "Hurry, Issa," Thorn urged, his voice strained. "It's almost through." Issa worked furiously, her brow furrowed in concentration. She mixed the spore solution with a series of chemicals, carefully following a complex formula. "Almost there," she muttered, her eyes fixed on the mixture. Suddenly, the vault door burst open, showering them with metal fragments. The jaguar bloom stood in the doorway, its eyes burning with a malevolent intelligence. "Issa now," Thorn shouted, his voice filled with desperation. Issa took a deep breath and injected the synthesized cure into a syringe. "This is it," she said, her voice trembling. "Our only chance." She turned and faced the jaguar bloom, holding the syringe in her hand. "Time to end this nightmare," she said, her voice filled with determination. Chapter 8: The Cure and the Confrontation. Issa stood her ground, the syringe filled with the hastily synthesized cure clutched in her hand. The jaguar bloom loomed in the doorway, a monstrous amalgamation of predator and fungus, its eyes burning with predatory hunger. Thorn stood beside her, ready to defend her with anything he could find. Lee huddled in the corner, his face buried in his hands, lost to terror. "This ends now," Issa said, her voice surprisingly steady despite the fear that must have been coursing through her. She advanced towards the jaguar bloom, syringe extended. The creature roared, a deafening sound that echoed in the confined space of the vault. It lunged forward, its massive paws outstretched, ready to tear Issa apart. Thorn acted instinctively. He grabbed a discarded metal container and hurled it at the jaguar bloom. The container struck the creature in the snout, momentarily distracting it. Issa seized the opportunity. She darted forward and plunged the syringe into the jaguar bloom's neck, injecting the cure into its bloodstream. The creature recoiled, its body convulsing. It roared in pain and rage, its fungal fur pulsating with a sickly green light. "Did it work?" Thorn asked, his voice barely audible above the creature's roars. "I don't know," Issa replied, her eyes fixed on the jaguar bloom. "We have to wait and see." The creature continued to convulse, its body writhing in agony. The fungal growths on its fur began to wither and decay. Its eyes lost their malevolent glow. Slowly, gradually, the creature's convulsions subsided. Its roars turned into whimpers, its body slumped to the floor. The fungal fur turned brown and brittle, crumbling to dust. The creature's eyes closed, and its breathing became shallow and labored. Finally, it lay still, its body lifeless. The jaguar Bloom was dead. "It's over," Issa said, her voice filled with disbelief. "We did it." Thorn let out a sigh of relief, his muscles finally relaxing. They had faced death and emerged victorious. But he knew their ordeal wasn't over yet. There were still infected people to contend with, and the outpost was still in chaos. "We need to get back to the lab," Thorn said, his voice firm, "and synthesize more of the cure. There are still people who need our help." They cautiously approached the vault door, their eyes scanning the corridor outside. It appeared to be deserted. "All right," Thorn said. "Let's move, but be careful. We don't know what's waiting for us out there." They stepped out of the vault and into the corridor. The emergency lights were still flickering, casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. As they moved down the corridor, they encountered a group of scientists, their faces pale and drawn. They were armed with makeshift weapons, metal rods, wrenches, anything they could find. "Are you all right?" Thorn asked, approaching the group. "We're alive," one of the scientists replied, his voice weary. "But the outpost is a mess. The infected are everywhere. We've lost contact with the outside world." "We have the cure," Issa said, holding up the syringe. "We can stop the fungus." The scientists' faces lit up with hope. "You do?" one of them asked, his voice filled with relief. "Thank God. We've been trying to fight it, but it's been no use. The fungus is too powerful." "We need your help," Thorn said. "We need to get back to the lab and synthesize more of the cure. Can you help us?" "Of course," the scientist replied. "We'll do anything we can." The scientists joined Thorn and Issa, forming a small group of survivors. They moved cautiously through the outpost, their eyes scanning for any sign of danger. As they approached the lab, they encountered a group of infected scientists, their eyes vacant, their bodies twisted and deformed by the fungus. "Stop," Thorn shouted, raising his hand. "We don't want to hurt you. We have the cure." The infected scientists ignored him. They advanced towards the group, their hands outstretched, their eyes filled with a murderous rage. "They're not listening to us," Issa said, her voice filled with despair. "They're too far gone." "We have no choice," Thorn said, his voice grim. "We have to defend ourselves." The survivors raised their weapons and prepared to fight. The battle for the outpost had begun. Chapter 9: The Bitter End. The clash was brutal and desperate. The survivors, armed with makeshift weapons and fueled by adrenaline and fear, fought valiantly against the infected scientists. Thorn found himself wielding a metal pipe, swinging it with brutal efficiency, his years of repressed anger finally finding an outlet. Issa, despite her scientific background, fought with surprising ferocity, using her knowledge of the human body to incapacitate her attackers. Lee, surprisingly, found a twisted courage, using his small size to his advantage, darting between the legs of the infected and delivering painful blows with a wrench. But the infected were relentless. Driven by the fungus, they seemed immune to pain, their bodies moving with a disturbing, unnatural strength. The battle raged through the corridors of the outpost, the air filled with the sounds of screaming, groaning, and the sickening thud of metal against flesh. The survivors fought their way to the lab, their numbers dwindling with each passing moment. By the time they reached the door, only Thorn, Issa, and two other scientists remained. They barricaded the lab door, piling furniture and equipment against it. But they knew it wouldn't hold for long. The infected were determined to get inside, and their numbers were overwhelming. "We need to synthesize the cure," Thorn said, his voice ragged. "It's our only chance." Issa rushed to the synthesis equipment and began to work furiously, her hands moving with practiced speed. The two remaining scientists helped her, their faces pale but determined. Thorn stood guard at the door, his metal pipe raised, his eyes fixed on the barricade. He could hear the infected pounding against the door, their groans and screams growing louder and more insistent. Suddenly, the barricade splintered and the door burst open. The infected flooded into the lab, their eyes burning with a malevolent green light. "Fight!" Thorn shouted, charging forward to meet the onslaught. The battle raged again, more intense and desperate than before. Thorn fought like a man possessed, his body moving with a speed and strength he never knew he possessed. But the infected were too many, their numbers overwhelming. One by one, the survivors fell, their bodies twisted and broken. Thorn watched in horror as one of the scientists was dragged down, his screams cut short by the sickening crunch of bone. He knew it was only a matter of time before they were all overwhelmed, but he refused to give up. He had come too far, sacrificed too much. He would fight to the bitter end. Suddenly, he saw Issa collapse to the floor, her face pale, her body trembling. She had been bitten. "Issa," Thorn shouted, rushing to her side. It's too late," she gasped, her voice weak. "I'm infected." Thorn knelt beside her, his heart filled with despair. He had failed. He had failed to protect her. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. It's not your fault," Issa said, reaching out and touching his face. You did everything you could." Her eyes closed and her body went limp. She was gone. Thorn cradled her body in his arms, his tears falling on her lifeless face. He had lost everything. His wife, his career, his hope. Now he had lost Issa, the one person who had given him a reason to keep fighting. He looked up at the infected, their eyes fixed on him, their bodies writhing with hunger. He knew his time was up. He stood up, his face set, his eyes filled with a grim determination. He would not go down without a fight. He raised his metal pipe and charged at the infected, his voice screaming. The infected swarmed him, their hands tearing at his flesh, their teeth sinking into his body. Thorn fought with a ferocity born of despair, but it was no use. The infected were too many, too strong. He felt a sharp pain in his chest, and his vision began to blur. He stumbled, his legs giving way beneath him. He collapsed to the floor, his body broken, his spirit crushed. He looked up at the infected, their faces looming over him, their eyes filled with triumph. He closed his eyes, his mind filled with images of his wife, of Issa, of all the people he had loved and lost. He took a final breath, and the world went black. The outpost was silent, save for the rustling of leaves in the wind and the distant, guttural calls of the monkeys. The fungus had won. Chapter 10: Echoes in the Green. Time became an indistinguishable blur within the heart of the Amazon. Days bled into nights, marked only by the changing patterns of rain and the relentless chorus of the jungle. The research outpost, once a beacon of scientific ambition, was now a tomb, its buildings choked with fungal growth, its corridors haunted by the silent specters of those who had perished. The jungle reclaimed its territory. Vines snaked across the chain-link fence, tearing it down, while the thick, verdant undergrowth crept over the concrete foundations of the buildings. The fungus, its tendrils reaching everywhere, thrived. Its spores carried on the wind, seeking new hosts, new territories. The Amazon was its kingdom, and the outpost was just another meal. Weeks later, a small plane, weathered and patched, circled above the dense canopy. Inside, a lone figure, his face etched with a mixture of determination and apprehension, peered down at the endless expanse of green. He was Carlito Ruiz, a local worker who had abandoned the outpost weeks before the outbreak, his superstitious nature warning him of impending doom. He had heard the rumors, whispers carried on the wind, tales of a cursed fungus that turned men into monsters. He had tried to warn the others, but they had dismissed his concerns as mere superstition. Now he was returning, not out of a sense of duty, but out of a desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, something remained worth salvaging. Carlito guided the pilot towards a small clearing near the outpost. The plane touched down, kicking up a cloud of dust and debris. Carlito disembarked, his machete held firmly in his hand, his eyes scanning the perimeter. The air was heavy with the smell of decay and damp earth. The silence was unsettling, broken only by the chirping of insects and the distant calls of birds. He approached the outpost cautiously, his heart pounding in his chest. The scene that greeted him was one of utter desolation. The buildings were overgrown with fungus, their walls crumbling, their windows broken. The chain-link fence was torn down, its razor wire tangled in the undergrowth. It was a scene of utter ruin, a testament to the destructive power of nature. Carlito moved through the outpost, his machete clearing a path through the dense vegetation. He saw signs of the struggle that had taken place, bloodstains on the walls, overturned furniture, discarded weapons. The memories of the people he knew, the scientists and workers who had laughed at his fears, now weighed heavily on his conscience. He reached the main laboratory, his destination. It was here, he reasoned, that any remaining traces of the fungus might be found, any clues to its origins, any hope of finding a way to stop its spread. The lab was a scene of utter chaos. Equipment lay scattered on the floor, vials were broken, and the air was thick with the smell of chemicals. He moved cautiously through the wreckage, his eyes scanning for anything of interest. Suddenly he heard a sound, a low guttural moan emanating from the far corner of the lab. He froze, his blood running cold. He cautiously approached the corner, his machete raised, his senses on high alert. He peered around the corner, and his eyes widened in horror. He saw a figure lying on the floor, its body twisted and deformed by the fungus. It was a man, or what was left of one. His skin was covered in fungal growths, his eyes were vacant, and his mouth emitted a low, mournful moan. It was Dr. Jian Li, the geneticist who had been so obsessed with the fungus, so driven by his ambition, so blind to the dangers he was unleashing. Li looked up at Carlito, his eyes filled with a flicker of recognition. He reached out a hand, his fingers a mass of writhing tendrils. "Help me," he croaked, his voice barely audible. Carlito hesitated for a moment, his heart filled with pity. But he knew he couldn't help Li. He was too far gone. He raised his machete and brought it down with swift, decisive force. Li's moan was cut short, and his body went limp. Carlito stood there for a moment, his chest heaving, his mind filled with a mixture of sadness and relief. He had ended Li's suffering, but he had also extinguished any hope of finding a cure. He turned and walked out of the lab, his machete held firmly in his hand. He had seen enough. There was nothing left for him here. He returned to the plane, his heart heavy with the knowledge of what had happened. He had witnessed the destructive power of the fungus, the terrible cost of scientific hubris. He knew that the world outside this isolated outpost was unaware of the danger that lurked within the Amazon, a threat that could spread and consume everything in its path. As the plane took off, Carlito looked back at the outpost, a small cluster of buildings swallowed by the vastness of the jungle. He knew that he would never forget what he had seen, the horrors he had witnessed. The plane climbed higher, soaring above the canopy, leaving the outpost behind, a silent testament to the darkness that could bloom in the heart of the green. The fungus remained, a silent, patient predator waiting for its next opportunity, its spores carried on the wind, whispering through the trees, echoing in the green. The end.